please turn to John chapter 5. We'll be starting off there. We'll be kind of moving around today. And I want to preface this. I know this is going to be a challenging message. And I say that in the sense that you really need to be receptive to what God is going to speak to you through the Word today. Because I believe that if you listen to what God says, there could be transformation that happens today in regards to some of the struggles that you might be facing in your life. And I want to open up by going to our central question that we've been doing through this study that we've been about reflecting Jesus. And this is the question that's been before all of us. It's, does my life reflect Jesus to the world around me? And I have encouraged you that over the next few weeks to continue to think about this question. And it's something that I've said I've been doing myself. And in fact, I thought about this question the other day because I came across this article that was in the Christian Post. And the title of the article was the following: 8 reasons some young people were walking away from their faith. And the reason why I thought about this question, because there's really two full purpose of that question that we're focusing upon this study. Number one, the obvious one, is it's a time for self-reflection. To you to look at your life and say, Lord, does my life reflect the very life of Jesus Christ? And then the secondary reason, which I think is just as important, is that we live in a world today that needs to see in you and I authentic examples of Jesus Christ. In fact, that second one was what prompted me to think about this question, because this article was written by an author who, like myself, is both a pastor and a professor. And he begins to share conversations that he's had with young people. And in these conversations, he comes to find out there were 8 reasons why they had walked away from their Christian upbringing. Why, when they were younger, they were raised in a Christian family, they were brought to church. Why, as they got older, did they walk away from the Christian faith? And as I was reading this article, it made me think about conversations I have also had with younger people. And the one that stuck out to my mind that he brought up is one that I hear all the time of why people walk away from their Christian faith that they were raised on, is this one: hypocrisy among believers. The author puts it this way. He says they've seen too much hypocrisy amongst believers. Sometimes, to be honest, they've seen the hypocrisy in their own homes. Their parents weren't the same people at home they were at church. In other cases, these young people have seen the moral failure of far too many church leaders. You see, hypocrisy, just to make sure that we're on the same page, it doesn't mean that we reflect hypocrisy as believers because we're living an imperfect life. The reality is, let's just be honest, there's not one person in this room who's ever lived a perfect life. We know that we're going to fall. So hypocrisy is not about imperfection. Rather, what hypocrisy means is that as believers, we are reflecting a life that is inconsistent, or you can use the word contradictory. It means you're calling other people to live by a standard that you yourself are not living by. And for you and I to truly reflect Jesus, we have got to make sure that we're not living a hypocritical life. Instead, we're living a life that is consistent with what we believe, that is consistent with the very commands of God's Word. That people see within us that authenticity, that although we're not perfect, they see us striving every day to consistently try to live by what God has called us to live by. In fact, what we're going to find out today, this is exactly how Jesus lived his life. He lived a perfect life of obedience. And this life of obedience, guess what Jesus has done for you and I? He has provided a pattern for how you and I are supposed to also live our lives. And so what our plan today is to look a little bit deeper at this life of obedience that Jesus lived, and then how you and I can begin to implement that into our own walk with him. Before we move on, I just want to do a quick review in case you've not been here the last 2 weeks. We were doing a series called How Do I Reflect Jesus to the World Around Me? That very first sermon, I took you to Romans chapter 8. And what Paul very clearly lays out to you and I is that the goal for us as believers is not salvation. That's right, it's not. It's not that moment you come to the cross. That's just the beginning of our walk with Christ. But once we come to that cross, Paul lays out that the goal that Jesus Christ has for every believer is what? To be conformed into his very image. We've been predestined. We've been set apart for that purpose of becoming more like Christ. So today, if you've given your life to Jesus, don't think that it ended at the cross. That's the beginning. What God is now calling you to do is to reflect the very one who gave his life for you. And we saw the very attribute that we see in Jesus' life that you and I need to start reflecting is we've got to spend time in solitude with God. And we saw in Jesus' life the value, the benefit that comes in that time of solitude. We saw it's a time where we get prepared to do what God has called us to do. It's where we get rejuvenated from the demands of life. It's where we gain wisdom and direction. And we also gain comfort and strength during those times of emotional, physical, and spiritual distress and agony. And so we've seen, I hope and pray that if you were here last week, that you begin to implement that time in your day where you say, the most important time of my day is this time alone with God, and I'm not going to let anyone take that time away. And so along with this solitude of God, the next area that we have got to reflect Jesus Christ in our life is through a life of obedience. So what does that mean? Well, it's going to take us here to John chapter 5. And what we're going to find in John chapter 5 is Jesus is going to make some powerful statements about who he is and why he came. So let me set the context for you for this chapter. In the first 9 verses, Jesus is in Jerusalem. He comes across the pool of Bethesda. And before we move on, you know what I love about Scripture? For many years, critics said, oh, come on, we can't trust the Bible. There's no pool of Bethesda. It's a made-up thing by John. But you know what happened? Archaeologists discovered the pool of Bethesda. And not only to discover, guess what they found out? It is exactly the way that John described. Don't think for any moment that the Bible that we have is not reliable. It speaks truth about the situations and the circumstances that were going on at that time. And so here's Jesus. He passes this pool of Bethesda, and while he's there, he finds a man, or sees a man, who had a debilitating disease for 30 years. Can you imagine, for 38 years, this man has been suffering in pain, limited of having a normal life. And I don't know if maybe you can relate to that. I certainly can't. But for 30 years, this has been the state of this man in this situation that he's in. And so when Jesus looks upon him, it says he does the following in verse 8 of chapter 5 of John. He says, get up, take up your bed and walk. Now you think about it. A man for 38 years has not been able to walk. You would think that people around him would be rejoicing. Look at this miracle. Look at this man set free from this infirmity. But we find the exact opposite. In fact, we find the religious authorities became angry because of what Jesus did. Because he healed the man on the Sabbath. That day that was supposed to be set aside for rest and to worship God. And we see in verse 16 that this anger leads them to actually persecuting Jesus. It says, and this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus. Literally means they were harassing him because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. See, this is a very important point that you grasp about obedience. Because what I'm going to call you today, or should I say the Word of God, is not calling you to obedience like the religious authorities. It's obedience of Jesus Christ. Because here the religious authorities, they knew about God's command, but what they said was, we're going to create our own man-made laws that go beyond God's commands. And in that process of making all these man-made laws, the laws became burdens upon the people. And they were such a burden that you see here with these religious authorities, it hardened their hearts to the needs of those around them to the point they could not even rejoice. But they became angry when Jesus sets this man free from that physical disability. And this is such an important point you grasp. Because what we find in these religious authorities, we find that word again that we're trying to avoid in our own lives is hypocrisy. See, there's 2 ways we can live a life of hypocrisy. The first one is one we all get, right? It's through our actions. That means when I say one thing, but I do another. I call a person to live by that standard, but I don't do it myself. But in the religious authorities, it went beyond that. And to me, they displayed a more dangerous hypocrisy because what it showed was what was in their heart. You see, they wanted God's mercy. They wanted His compassion. They wanted His grace, but they were unwilling to show that same to other people. And I'm going to tell you something right now. Hypocrisy is something not only should we deal with through our action, but it's a matter of our heart. That we don't do the same thing the religious authorities do, where we ask of God what we're not willing to extend to other people as well. And so as you go through the remainder of the 5th chapter of John, Jesus confronts these religious hypocrites, as we'll call them. And He does it by declaring who He was and why He came. And I encourage you on your own, read verses 17 through 29, because in this section right here, Jesus wants them to know very clear that He is equal with God. In other words, what you're looking at is not just the person who's fully man, but you're looking at someone who's also fully God. And He says, you want to know why I healed on that Sabbath day? Because not only am I equal with God in nature, I am equal with God in power, but I'm also equal with God in authority. He's making a claim about who He is. And after He explains who He is, He closes this section that we're in John chapter 5 and verse 30. And this is what He says about why He came to this earth. He says the following, I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of Him who sent me. Jesus is very clear right here. That's what I love about Jesus. He's not equivocating. He's not trying to dance around the whole thing. He's like, look, this is why I came. And He's very clear. I came to fulfill the will of my Father. And in fulfilling the will of the Father, there's 2 aspects of this that we see in the life of Jesus. First of all, He has yielded Himself to the will of the Father. You see, Jesus, He says these words, I can do nothing on my own. In other words, what He's saying is, I didn't come to act on my own initiative. but I willingly submitted myself to the Father's will. And besides yielding himself to the will of the Father, we see in this verse here that Jesus said, I have come to obey the will of the Father. He says it in this way, I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. You see, Jesus is laying out, not just for that audience today or then, but the audience today. He's saying, this is why I came to this earth. I came to fulfill the will of my Father. I came to be obedient to why the Father sent me in the first place. This affirmation of the reason why I came is throughout Scripture. Once again, we see a time where Jesus is being asked who he is. And there's this ongoing reality. People want to know, who is this person? He's doing all these miracles, all these signs and wonders. He speaks with an authority that we've never seen before. They want to know who he is. And so once again, they ask that question, who are you? In response, Jesus says the following. This is John chapter 8, verse 28. He says, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he. That I do nothing on my own authority, but speak just as the Father taught me. And he who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do the things that are pleasing to him. You see, in this verse, Jesus is very clear. He's saying, my whole life, everything that I do, the very purpose of why I came is to reflect to everyone else a life that is yielded and obedient to the will of the Father and to do that which pleases him. You see, many people say, God, what is your plan for my life today? What's your desire in my life? And don't you see that if we're to reflect Jesus Christ, that is his desire for you right now, no matter where you may be. He is looking at you and saying, do you see what my desire is? My desire is for you to be obedient and yielded to the will of the Father, and all that you do is pleasing in his sight. And Jesus shows us the perfect way of doing this. And here's the beauty. In this verse, he tells them, should I say, you don't want to know the ultimate way that I'm going to demonstrate my obedience and being yielded? I'm going to go to the cross and give up my life willingly for the sins of this world. And so what we find in both of these verses, in John chapter 5 and John chapter 8, we see both God the Father and God the Son, which is Jesus, they are working together in the plan of salvation. The Father sends the Son submits to the will of the Father, and the beauty of it is there's complete unity and agreement in what they are called to do together to bring salvation to you and I. Now, I know your faces look like the first two services. You're like, man, how do I fully understand, God the Son, God the Father working together? How does this make sense? Well, I'll just make 2 points. First of all, God is not like you and I. He's a spiritual being. He's not limited by the physical reality that we are in as well. But secondly, there's a mystery about God that's going to transcend our human minds. And I said it's those mysteries about God that I love the most, because that's where I say, God, that's where you deserve honor and praise and glory, because you're so far beyond me. Because once again, if I can create God in a way that I can fully understand, I have made God in my own image. And so it's those mysteries of God that draw us to that point of adoration and praise. And so now that we see Jesus very clear, he said, this is who I am and this is why I've came. Let's look at his life. How does that obedience look like in his life? And what I decided to do is to give you 3 examples this morning. And there's a reason why there's 3. Because what we're going to see in these 3 examples, they reflect the 3 challenges that everyone in this room is going to face living a life that's obedient and yielded to God. And so the very first one we see in Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus is tempted with the desires of this world. We dealt with this passage last week. We all remember Jesus goes into the wilderness. He is tempted by Satan. And I want to focus on that third temptation, which we see here in Matthew 4, verses 8 and 9. It says again, the devil took him to a very high mount and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these I'll give to you, if you'll fall down and you'll worship me. You see, what Satan is doing to Jesus right here, he's tempting him by offering Jesus all the things that people, desire in this world. And what do we desire? Power, authority, prestige, all these things. Say, look, I'll give these all to you. And we look at it and say, well, how can Satan give that to Jesus? I thought Jesus was God. Well, here's a biblical truth. When Adam failed and he fell in the garden, at that moment, God gave delegated authority over this world to Satan. That's why in Scripture, Satan's referred to as the ruler of this world, the God of this age. So with this delegated authority, Satan's like, look, I know one day Jesus is going to take it off of me, but I'm going to try to tempt him to get him to disobey God by saying, look at Jesus, why don't you just fall down and worship me? What's the big deal? Because in this temptation, the heart of what Satan's trying to do is get Jesus to disobey the will of the Father and to find a different way around the cross. He's looking at Jesus saying, Jesus, come on. There's an easier way. There's a quicker way. Because one day we know you're going to be restored to glory. You're going to get all this back that has been given to me. But why don't we just bypass that? Why go to the cross? All you got to do, Jesus, is just disobey, just a little compromise. Just surrender and worship to me, and I'll give it all back to you right now. And we find Jesus' response in verse 10. And once again, when Jesus responds, there's no equivocation. There's no, well, let me think about this, or maybe I'll meet you halfway. He decisively chooses to obey the will of the Father and not compromise even for the desires of this world. This is what he says in verse 10. Then Jesus said to him, "Be gone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." You see, and the reality is this, it's no different in the life of Jesus than in our life as well. Every day you and I are facing that same temptation. We're facing the desires of this world. We're facing that choice. Do we compromise and give in to the desires of this world, or are we going to choose this day to be obedient and not pursue the desires of this world, but to desire to honor and glorify Jesus Christ in all that we do? And when we choose to obey just like Jesus did, there's a cost involved. Because when you choose today to go out of this room and you choose not to compromise, you choose to follow God, there will be a cost involved, I promise you. The cost could be friends, could be the loss of a job promotion, could be the loss of being accepted by others, where instead of being accepted, you face rejection. But the reality is this, the cost of whatever you give up to be obedient to God does not compare to the cost He gave up to give you salvation. And beyond that, no matter what you give up to Jesus, does not compare to what you gain. You see, in this world that we live in, you know what you're going to gain? Temporal pleasure. Yeah, for a season, for a moment, it's going to feel great. It's going to feel like all the problems of the world, that stress, that anxiety, that depression I'm dealing with, that somehow it's been satisfied. But you know what's going to happen? You'll wake up one day and realize, wow, it did not satisfy. That longing in my soul was still there. And what do? You desperately go try to find something else. I'm telling you, the desires of this world will only give you temporal pleasure. But when you give your life to Jesus Christ, you know what you're going to find? You're going to find the satisfaction of your longing for eternity. So that's the very first thing Jesus shows us. How do we maintain obedience with all the desires of the world around us? And the second way He wants to show us is how we can be obedient when we deal with the desires of other people in our lives. This will take us to John chapter 6. Jesus has been just displayed one of His greatest miracles. It's the feeding of 5,000 people. Many of you know that. It was 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And I was thinking about that. I'm like, wow, I can't feed my own family with that. And here's Jesus feeding 5,000, right? So what a great miracle. And so what we find after this miracle, we find the response of the crowd to what Jesus did. And this is what it says in verse 15. It says, perceiving then that they were about to come and make Him, or take Him by force, should I say, to make Him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by Himself. You see, the excitement of what this crowd saw, they saw this great miracle, was going through their mind as well. Wow, this is a guy we can make king. We can use His power, we can use His authority to do what? To override the Roman occupation. He can set us free. So in their minds, they had this expectation or desire to make Jesus their political king at that very moment. And what's Jesus' response? He walks away in obedience because Jesus knows that their desire does not match the desire that the Father has for him. He realizes that if he responds to their desire, he has placed in jeopardy the very reason why he came, which is to bring salvation to the world. So Jesus walks away from the crowd. How many times, maybe right now, in your life right now, you're in a situation right now where there are other people right now trying to get you to do things that you know you should not do. You know what God's calling you to do? He's calling you to obedience. And I'm telling you right now, this is not from me, it's from God's word. That obedience might, right now, listen to me, it may mean that you need to walk away from that person in that situation. You need to follow Jesus Christ in obedience. But see, the desires and expectations people had on Jesus wasn't just the crowds. It was those very close to him. We can all relate to that, right? It's not just the people around you, but sometimes the hardest ones are the people that are very close to you. And Jesus experiences that. His closest friends had a desire or expectation of what they wanted Jesus to do for them. And we find this in Matthew chapter 16. Because here's Jesus. He's having a conversation with his disciples that he's going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to suffer and die, and then 3 days later be risen from the grave. And in the profession of why he came to this earth, Peter responds the following. We all know Peter, right? Because we've all been Peter. We put our foot in our mouth all the time. But this is what Peter says in verse 22. And Peter took him aside. He began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you." Now, please understand, Peter's not pulling Jesus aside and saying, hey, I want to have just a small conversation because I think you might be misunderstood here, Lord. Maybe I need to correct you a little. Peter's not having a calm conversation. He is yelling at Jesus. He is rebuking Jesus. He's correcting him, saying, you got it wrong. This is not what God called you to do. Because once again, Peter had his own expectations of what he wanted Jesus to do for him and for the people of Israel. So here's Peter with these strong language questioning Jesus, trying to tell him that he's wrong in regards to the plan that God has for his life. And Jesus, knowing very clearly what he was called to do, and he's unwilling to give in to even to the desires of his very closest friends, this is what Jesus says to Peter in verse 23. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. It's a strong response by Jesus, right? But he wants to be very clear with Peter, someone he loves dearly, that he will not let anyone, even Peter, be a stumbling block in his life to fulfill what God has called him to do. For Jesus, in every situation, but specifically here, there's one course of action that was complete obedience to the will of the Father. Jesus wasn't going to deviate from that, no matter what the expectation was of the crowd or his very close friends. He's like, I've come here for one purpose and one purpose only. That's to do the will of the Father, and no one will lead me away from accomplishing that. And the thing about it is we can all relate to this. Because just like Jesus, there are those right in our lives right now, they have their own desires and expectations for us. And sometimes these desires and expectations that people have for us, it comes at the cost of disobeying God. And the reality is today, if you are honest with the Lord, some of you in this room right now, you are living your life to please them rather than please God. You are living your life to fulfill their desires that they have for you rather than fulfilling the desires that God has for your life. And the reality is right now you're in relationships, you're in situations that have led you to places and to things that you thought you would never do, but you're doing it even though you know it's dishonoring the Lord because it's the desires of other people that you have allowed to guide and direct your life. And today, you need to do as Jesus did. You need to affirm that you're going to obey God and that you're not going to follow the desires of others. That may mean right now, God is very clear to you. You need to walk away from a person or from a situation like Jesus walked away from that crowd. Or it could be someone in your life that you can't really walk away from, but you need to have that heart-to-heart like Jesus did with Peter to tell him, look, I love you and I want you part of my life, but I'm going to be very clear right now. I will not compromise my faith. This is who I am and this is what I'm living for. And you nor no one else will let the desires that you have for me change or override the desires that God has for my life. I want to be very clear. Not every desire a person has for your life is bad, right? But you have got to do like Jesus. You have got to assess the desires people put upon you to ensure are they in line with the desires that God has for your life. And I'm telling you, if they're not right now, then you have got to make a conscious decision to say that I am today going to live my life yielded and obedient to God's will, not to the will of other people. Just like Jesus, you got to follow him that. You may be looking at me and saying, I hear what you're saying, but I don't really know what God's will is. And I understand sometimes there's specific situations where we're still praying, trying to seek God's will, right? But has not this whole series told you what God's desire is? He's looking at you right now. It doesn't matter what phase of life you're in, what situation that you're in. And God knows, but what God has said, in the midst of that situation, I have revealed my desire and my will for you and what it is, that you'll become more like Jesus Christ. That people around you will see the very one who gave his life reflected through the way that you live your life. We know what God's desires. I'm going to tell you something right now. If there's someone in your life who is causing you to not reflect Jesus Christ, you have got to decide what you're going to do with that relationship. It's either you need to end it or you need to confront that person and say, this is what I'm living for. I'm living for him, not for you. And the thing about it is, there's been times where I have to be quite honest with you. When you guys aren't here, I found myself literally in the office crying. And probably two of the main things I've cried for is I've cried for people who have come here and they've walked away. And I see them going down a path of destruction. It breaks my heart. I said, Lord, what can I do more? And I realized there's nothing I can do. I can only be faithful to preach the truth. But you know, there's other times where I've cried in my office because I have seen people in this church come to me. They say, BJ, I want to obey the Lord. I know I'm living in disobedience, but I've come today for you to pray with me because I'm going to change my situation. I have watched people in this church, they have let go of friends. They have let go of a job because they knew that those were compromising their walk with the Lord. I have seen people in this church that are living with other people in sin, and they know it's wrong before the Lord, and they said, I refuse to disobey God anymore. I want this relationship right, and they have sought to honor God in that relationship. And has there been a cost for those people? Yes, there has. But I'll tell you this, that cost has not reflected what they've gained from that. Because they've experienced God's presence and God's favor. But more than that, you know what else they've experienced? God using their faithfulness in that situation onto the Lord to be an authentic example to other people about how to follow Christ. And today, maybe that's the only reason why you're here. Everything that I've said now, or I'll say after this, it's just kind of going in one ear out the other. But I pray right now, you're hearing what God is speaking to you very clear through the Word. He is looking at you and saying, you've come here today because I am calling you to this area in your life to walk in obedience before me. And whatever that is before the Lord, I pray that before you go, you'll get it right with the Lord. And so besides the desires of the world, desires of others, the last example we're going to see is how Jesus showed obedience over the desire of self. This takes us to Luke chapter 22. It's a great passage. We all kind of know the context here. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? He's with his disciples. He walks a little bit farther away. He gets down and begins to pray. And the prayer that he does is preparing him for the next day when he'll go to the cross and die for the sins of the world. And what Jesus says in those prayers in verse 42, I'm just going to tell you right now, they are some of the strongest words ever spoken in human history. Because in these words, he shows us what it means for you and I to reflect Christ in obedience. And this is what he says. He says, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. You see, in those words, Jesus is demonstrating a life that's completely yielded and obedient to the Father. And we saw last week that in that moment, Jesus is going through serious physical and spiritual agony. He knows what he's about to go through. And literally, the passage we saw last week said that he was literally sweating drops of blood because of the sense of emotional stress that was upon his body. But in that moment, he said, look, it's not my will, it's yours. I'm going to surrender to what you've called me to do, to accomplish the purpose of why I came to this earth. In fact, Jesus shows throughout his life continual obedience, but there's not a greater act of obedience that he showed than at this very moment. In fact, the Apostle Paul says the following in Philippians 2:8. He said, in being found in human form, Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. You see, Jesus going to the cross is provided for you and I the perfect example of what it means to be yielded and obedient to God. And it is through that obedience that Jesus showed that brought forth salvation to the entire world. And that's the reality for all of you and I. Because look even as followers of Christ, we're going to have selfish desires, aren't we? There's things we're going to say, well, I want to do this. I want to live like that. And I know that the Bible doesn't say that, but, come on, God's not going to, let's be real with it. We all are going to struggle with our own selfish desires. And every day we're going to come before the Lord. And we got to ask ourselves, how are we going to live? Because there's some right here in this room, and I'm just saying this out of pure love. You're going to God and you are saying, it's my will, God, not yours. And the greatest example of obedience to show you truly are yielded to God is when you get on your knees and say, God, I know that this is my sinful desire or my selfish desire. I know I want to do this, but God, today, like every day, it is not my will. It is yours be done. That's what it means to be yielded and obedient. To come to that place that Jesus did, where I seek not for my own glory, for my own selfish gain, but I seek to give glory and honor to Jesus Christ and Him alone. So now that we've seen this life of obedience, I want to close by just giving you 3 practical points of how that obedience can look like in your life. How can we strive like Jesus to live obedient, to be yielded? And the first thing I want to start with what I call the starting point of obedience. You know where that begins? It begins through what I call dying to self. See, it's doing exactly what Jesus modeled for us, where we must willingly surrender or submit our lives over to God. Because the thing about it is God is not going to compel you and I to obedience. He's not going to stand there and force us, manipulate us. He has said, I've given you freedom to make a choice. Choose this day whom you're going to serve, right? We're all facing that choice every day. God's not like a puppet master trying to control us by pulling the strings. He says, I've given you freedom. You have to choose today who you're going to serve. And the reality is every single day we have to ask that question. Am I going to die to self today, and am I going to honor and obey God? In fact, Jesus puts it this way in Matthew 16:24. He said, if anyone would come after me, let him or her deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. It's the reality. Every day you and I are called to bear our cross, to die to self, and to follow Jesus Christ. And the thing about it, you might look and say, come on, man, that's a big cost, isn't it? I mean, why would Jesus ask that of me? He asked it for your own benefit because he realizes that how much of us are trying to find what it means to live, to find true life in the things of this world. And what we found is this world is not giving us what we're looking for. It's still making us empty. It's still giving us depression. It's still giving us anxiety. We're still longing for some sense of hope and peace and joy. And that's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, look, if you want to know what it really means to live, you want to know what it means to have true life in me, it starts with dying to self. Because the moment that you die to self and put your faith in me, then you'll know what it means to truly live. And today, God's looking at all of you and saying, do you want to truly live with me? Because listen to these words in verse 25. He says, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. In other words, the moment that I die to self, you know what Jesus says? Now you can begin to truly live in me and the life that I have for you. Beyond this starting point of obedience, the next is what I call the motivation of obedience. You see, the motivation of obedience to God is not out of duty or obligation. I know many of you may have been raised by that and say, okay, just like I got to do all these things for my boss, whoever, that's what I got to do for God. All these checklists, right? These do's and don'ts. It's not out of duty or obligation. Listen, motivation of obedience is not done out of fear of punishment. Some of you guys are like, man, if I don't obey God, I'm in trouble. He's going to strike me with a lightning bolt, right? He's going to put his favor is going to be off of me. He's going to make my life miserable. But I want to be very clear. That is not the motivation for obedience. The motivation for obedience to God's command is one word, and it's love. In fact, we're told in 1 John 5:3, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. When I was thinking about this point, maybe go back to when I was younger, I used to attend this church, man, and I would just tell you, this church ran like the religious authorities of Jesus' time. Because they had so many rules that went beyond God's word. And with these rules, it was all about, this is what you have to do, and if you don't do it, God's going to not love you. And these rules were like things like you couldn't play cards, you couldn't dance, you couldn't go to the movies. And the sad reality of this is that it placed such a heavy burden upon everyone because everyone's like, there's no way I can achieve this, that many walked away from that church. And guess what? To this day, they've never come back to church. I was just out to dinner yesterday with my wife, and I saw one of those people from that church. And to this day, he still has not come back. See, obedience to God's command is not a form of legalism. It's not a list of do's and don'ts where God is standing around saying, okay, I want to take away your freedom. I don't want you to have fun. That's not why God has given us commands. See, that this obedience to God's command, it functions within a loving relationship between us and God. He first loved us. How do you love me, God? How do you show me that you love me? He goes, look at the cross. I gave my life for you. And out of that response to his love for me, now my obedience is prompted out of love for him. And so I see his commands so much differently. His commands are not restrictions. They're not trying to control me, but I see as a loving father for his son, he says, I see those commands as what? Protection, for his favor in my life, because I know how much he loves me because he showed it through the cross. You see, when love motivates your obedience, it redefines not just your relationship with God, but it redefines how you see his commands in your life. And the last thing I'll just simply say is this. Besides the starting point, the motivation of obedience, there's the fruit of obedience. See, there is a cost in obedience. We all know that. And many of you here in this room could say, hey, this is what I've lost to follow Christ. But the reality is that whatever you may give up, there's always something greater in return. Because right now, if you choose to walk in obedience, you're going to experience God's blessing now, his favor and his presence. I'm not talking about material. I'm talking about that sense that you know God is with you. You can have that peace in the midst of the storm, right? But beyond that present reality, you know what? There's a day coming when Jesus Christ says that I'm going to not only remember, but I'm going to reward all those who've been faithful to me. You see, as a pastor, I yearn for that day. And I tell you, when that day comes, I'm going to be weeping. Because I'm going to look at the very one who gave his life for me. And I yearn to hear him say, son, I love you so much. You have been faithful. And now let me reward you. Enter into the joy of my kingdom. Should that not be the desires of all of our hearts, to have the very one who said, I gave my life for you, to say, look, I look at you and I say, you have been faithful, let me reward you. Because faithfulness is not a comparison game. It's not like, well, hey, you're doing more than I do. No. What God is saying, be faithful what I've given you, and I will reward you accordingly. It's the desire of God's heart. The desire of Jesus Christ is not just to come back and say, I'm going to judge the world. He desires to reward his children for their faithfulness. He longs for that day like we should long for. In fact, in the very words of Revelation 22:12, these are words spoken by Jesus himself. He says the following. He says, look, I am coming soon, bringing my reward with me to repay all people according to their deeds. What a day that'll be when we get rewarded for our faithfulness and being obedient to Christ. So I want to close today by going back to our key question, does my life reflect Jesus to the world around me? And to be able to answer that means you are going to choose to live a life that is yielded and obedient to what God has called you to do. Now, let's just be honest. It's going to be a daily struggle, right? Because there's going to be days where, man, I see victory today. There's going to be days where I'm like, man, I have just failed today. I have not been what I should have been. But the goal is this, that we are striving every day to become more like Jesus Christ in our obedience. Because the goal is not just to reflect him in how we're living, but that the world can see in you and I not a life of hypocrisy, but of authenticity of Jesus Christ. That's what we're displaying. And here's the encouragement. Because there's some in this room today saying, man, BJ, it's not just today, man. Yesterday, last week, you don't know what I have done. You don't know how far I have failed. If you can relate to what I'm saying right now, I'm going to tell you something. Your faith and your trust does not rest in your imperfect obedience. Do you know where your faith and trust rests in? The perfect obedience of Jesus Christ. That means although I'm striving every day to become more like Jesus Christ, those days where I fall short, I know, Lord, I did not do what I want to do. I know because of his perfect obedience, I can approach him and I will experience his forgiveness, his grace, and his mercy. It's because of his perfect obedience that forgiveness is available. It's because of his perfect obedience that me as a sinner can have a right relationship with a holy and righteous God. And see, even in our own struggles of trying to be like Christ, what a privilege to know what he has accomplished for us. And to know that every single day, that even when I fall short, he is willing and ready and able to show grace, mercy, and love. And this is my closing thought. Today, God's speaking to some of you in this room. He is saying today is the day for you to change a situation, change a relationship, because you know that it's causing you to disobey me. And today is the day to be yielded to me. To say in that very moment, that situation, not my will, but your will be done. But there are others in this room here right now that you are struggling because you're trying like the religious stories. I'm trying to work my way to God and I'm falling short every single day. And look at, the reality is trying to strive towards that reality, but recognize as you do that even the moments that you fall short, it's his perfect obedience that's speaking to you right now saying, son, daughter, don't you know what you couldn't do, I accomplished for you because I went to that cross. I gave you life. And so every day that you fall short, do you not see my grace and my mercy and my love? I look at you and I say, son and daughter, you've come to that cross. And in that brokenness and in that shortcoming, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to lift you up out of my love and I will walk with you. That's what Jesus Christ has done for us. And I hope today that everyone in this room can look at me and say, you know what? The desire of my heart is I want to walk like Christ. May I have that heart of obedience and being yielded to him. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, I thank you so much for a reminder of how we can reflect you. That through you, you provided a pattern for us to how we can walk in obedience and being yielded. And Lord, the beauty of it is that we strive, God, every day to become more like you, God. We realize in those moments of failure, oh my gosh, that it's because of your perfect obedience, God, that your forgiveness, your grace, your mercy, and your love is always available. Lord, speak through everyone today. Whatever they need to be challenged with, God, how they can reflect you more in this area, God, I pray your Spirit would clearly, God, minister that truth to them right now. And that all of us can walk away, God, recognizing the privilege that we have to represent you, but also the joy, God, to know that you have accomplished what we are incapable of doing. Because of that, we can receive that grace and mercy. We ask this all in your Son's precious name, Jesus. Amen.